We're going to talk today about laws pertaining to a Mechitza. We're going to talk about guidelines for a Mechitza in shul, but I hope that will open into a wider discussion of, in what context should men and women be together, and in what context is it suitable for men and women to be together. Okay. So the truth is, in terms of discussion on this topic in the Mishnah and Gemara, there is very little discussion. There's no discussion, for example, in the Gemara about, I suppose that the Bet Knesset doesn't exist at the time of the Gemara, but the place that we find a discussion that separates men and women is at a very exciting event in the Beit HaMikdash that took place once a year on Sukkot. And really, all of our understanding of when we should separate men and women is based on an analysis of this story, of when it was on Sukkot that men and women were separate, and understanding, reading the Gemara, why it is that they were separate, and then you can really extrapolate from there for all other situations. You follow? Okay, so I'm going to tell you the Mishnah. We're going to learn the Mishnah, and then after that we're going to learn the Gemara on the Mishnah, and then we'll learn the Rambam, and that will be our background. Once we've got the background, we're then going to go to two modern approaches to a Mechitza. One of them is Rav Moshe Feinstein. I think he's probably one of the most famous. He really wrote quite a bit about the topic of a Mechitza, perhaps more than many others, at least I saw a lot of it, a lot of Rav Moshe Feinstein, and then others who look at the world differently to him. But I would say it's Rav Moshe Feinstein. There's not that there's a big argument. There isn't even an argument between him. But he will mention one reason why Mechitza is important, and then we'll see in other sources another reason why Mechitza is important. And really, the modern Mechitza is based on considering both of the ideas mentioned by Rav Moshe Feinstein and those mentioned by other people. But all of them, Rav Moshe Feinstein and the other people that we'll look at, are all based on a Mishnah. Oh, wow. Just when you thought life couldn't get any better. Moishala, how are you doing? It's such a joy to see you. Such a good boy. Okay, we're going to start. So I said we're going to learn the Mishnah and we're going to learn the Gemara. And really, everything to understand when men and women are separated are really based on a close reading of this story. So the Mishnah tells us, this is in the last chapter of Masechet Sukkah. The last chapter of Masechet Sukkah talks about the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. There was this big event. They would draw water once a year and pour the water. It was drawn from the Shiloach spring, which we can visit today in Ir David, and the water was brought up from there onto the Har HaBayit, and it was poured with great celebration onto the Mizbeach. Once a year, water was poured onto the Mizbeach, and that service, that ceremony, is Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Nowadays, all the parties we do on Sukkot, all the concerts are like a zecher to Simchat Beit HaShoeva. So the Mishnah describes this event and says, Mi shelo ra'a Simchat Beit HaShoeva, lo ra'a Simcha miyamav. Now it's really quite a powerful statement. Anyone who didn't see a Simchat Beit HaShoeva never saw real joy. That's huge. That's really, it must have been incredible. It will be incredible. I'm very excited, Be'ezrat Hashem, to do it again soon. What was it? B'motzei Yom Tov Rishon, this is really the first day of Chol HaMoed, after the first day of Yom Tov, so this would be Tet Zayin B'Tishrei, Yardu Le'ezrat Nashim, they would go down into the courtyard area, the area that everybody could go into, and then the Mishnah says, U'metaknin Sham Tikun Gadol, and they would do a little change, a little amendment. Now this is actually a big amendment, Tikkun Gadol. Now this is interesting because the dimensions of the Beit HaMikdash were all prescribed, as we read in the book of Melachim when Shlomo HaMelech built the the first temple, and then likewise you read about in Ezra and Nehemiah about the building of the second Beit HaMikdash. The dimensions were all precise. So a tikkun gadol in something that was already prescribed is interesting, because you're tweaking a structure whose dimensions are significant, important. So a tikkun gadol is exciting, because it's not like adding a loft into your flat. This is, where the dimensions are relevant. The dimensions of the Beit HaMikdash were precise and important, and yet we see the Mishnah tells us they would do a tikkun gadol. They would change things in the courtyards of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, the Gemara then discusses what was the tikkun gadol. Do you see that? My tikkun gadol. What is this change that was made? Amar Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar taught, כאותה ששנינו חלקה הייתה בראשונה וכיפוע גזוז תורה. והתקינו שיהיו נשים יושבות מלמעלה ואנשים מלמטה. What they did was they really built like a balcony that would look over the courtyard, and the men would dance in the courtyard below, and the women would sit in the gallery above. You follow?
That's what the base measure looks like.
Exactly like Machon Meir's Beit Midrash that we were in just a few moments ago.
They probably based it off of the design of the Machon Meir base measure.
Right, okay.
I thought that the Chazan was real down low.
That's something else. No, we're not talking about Beit Knesset here. You're right, in a Beit Knesset, the Chazan traditionally is supposed to be lower down than everyone else, because he prays from the Mima'amakim, from the depths. But we're not talking about a Beit Knesset here. We're talking about a big celebration. This is not a prayer service. This is a celebration, a big courtyard, and you have the men on one floor, and they built these wooden balconies, and the women would be on the wooden balcony above, and the men were below.
That's like a bunch of shuls.
So we're not talking about a shul here. We're talking about a ceremony, but for this ceremony, men and women were separate. Now,
this is the tikkun itself, which therefore means that when they did tefillah, this was not the case. Which says, so it's the opposite of what we're saying. Machon Meir is not like it was for tefillah then, it's like it was for a celebration then.
So I want to come to tefillah. Let's continue. I think
sentence might change everything.
We'll talk about tefillah in a minute. Let me just finish the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan. Barishona, originally, Hayu nashim mibifnim va'anashim mibachutz. Originally, they had everyone on the same level, and they said, men this side, women that side. However, it didn't work. Vayu ba'im lidei kalut rosh. Now, do you see that? And that led to kalut rosh at this event. Hitkinu shiyu nashim yoshua mibachutz va'anashim mibifnim. They tried, instead of having the men outside, the women inside, they said, no, let's have the men inside and the men outside, but it still didn't work. Adain hayu ba'im lidei kalut rosh. And therefore, hitkinu shiyu nashim yoshua milemala va'anashim milemata.
So
that is the key question.
So it's easy head, no?
Kalut rosh means frivolity.
Yeah.
Like being frivolous. Like people not serious. It would take away from the decorum of the event. And kalut rosh is obviously inappropriate as part of Avodat Hashem. So we see from this Gemara that the purpose of the separation was to avoid kalut rosh. They tried method number 1, and they didn't manage to get rid of the kalut rosh. They tried method 2, still didn't manage to get rid of kalut rosh. Then the third method, men at the bottom and women at the above, that did get rid of the kalut rosh. So we see that kalut rosh seems to be the problem, and the solution is separating men and women. Now, the concept of a Beit Knesset is fascinating, and maybe one day we can talk about the history of a Beit Knesset, but really the Beit Knesset was only really, instituted in the Second Temple period when the Sidur was written. The Sidur was written by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah in the Second Temple period. But you can imagine, without a Sidur, you can't really have there's not a communal prayer experience. The communal prayer experience really began with the Siddur, and that's in the Second Temple period. So therefore, this whole model of, like being together or being separate, there was no communal prayer experience. But the rabbis saw that Kalut Rosh in Avodat Hashem needs to be avoided, and therefore, just like Kalut Rosh in this context of Avodat Hashem required men and women to be separate, therefore, in any context that requires some sense of decorum and sort of like appropriateness and behavior that's fitting for the place where you are, then separation of the sexes seems to be the right thing to do. That is the Gemara. Now we're going to look at the Rambam. The Gemara says, the Rambam adds one more piece, and we'll see. The Rambam says like this: Afal pi shekol hamoadot mitzvah lismoch b'hen. Every festival there's a mitzvah to celebrate. However, b'chag Sukkot hayta migdash yom simcha yetera. As we know, Sukkot is the time of simcha. Pesach is a time for being, celebrating. V'samachta b'chagecha. There's mitzvah on all of the festivals. However, there's something special about Sukkot.
It has three words.
The word simcha appears thrice.
With it.
Yes, v'samachta b'chagecha is actually one of them. Okay. V'samachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem shivat yamim. Okay, and how would they do it? Erev Yom Tov Rishon hayu metaknim b'mikdash makom lanashim milemala v'anashim milemata. Now look what the Rambam adds that we did not see in the Gemara. Why do they have the women upstairs and the men upstairs? Kedei shelo yit arvu elu im elu. In order that there should not be mixing of the sexes. Notice that phrase did not appear in the Gemara.
Right.
Lidarev is like to mix. Like chatting.
So therefore, is there any celebration on Purim, really?
How'd you get to Purim?
No, not Purim. Pesach.
Yeah, there is. Absolutely.
Because it doesn't say Sameach at all.
Yeah, but I think that every Chag has got a din of Simcha. There's a din of Simcha on every Chag, as we read in the Rambam just now.
Right. So
Kol hamoadot mitzvah lismoch b'hem. Right.
So Shavuos has one word of Chag next to it. There's a reason. There's a reason for celebration there. Sukkot has three reasons for celebration there, and Pesach has none. But the only reason for celebration is because we left Egypt.
No, it's a Chag. It's part of the sort of the uniqueness of a Chag. As we read here in the Rambam over here, is the idea of Simcha. But Sukkot, more than the other two, Pesach and Shavuot, is Simcha Yetera. And therefore they separated. But the phrase I want to focus on in the Rambam is not the Simcha, Shelo yit'arvu elu im elu. U'matchil mitzmo mosei yom tov rishon, v'chein b'chol yom v'yom b'mei cholo shel moed, matchilim me'achar she'ikriv t'amid shel bein arba'im l'smoch, v'shar hayom im kol halayla. They would party all night long. Okay, so we see there are two things that are important to avoid in Avodat Hashem. The first one is Kalut Rosh. Kalut Rosh, lightheartedness, and the second one is like the men and women shouldn't be mixing with one another. You follow? Mm-hmm. Now I want to say two things. I don't like this word very much, and maybe you'll help me come up with a better word for it. I think Kalut Rosh means flirting a little bit. It's like it's just not mechubad. I don't like using that word.
Intimate discussion.
No, it's not. It's it's like playing around. I'll give you an example.
Silliness even could be.
Yeah, it's just like being.
This is how you flirt.
Yeah, you just like being silly. I mean, it's just not dignified. It's not appropriate. I mean, you probably don't know about this because you are all holy good boys. But I remember, sometimes teenagers. You have a group of teenage boys, 16-year-olds, and they're all talking and having a sensible discussion about something. Then a girl comes along, and they all and likewise in other direction, group of girls and a boy. That is kalut rosh. I'm not sure flirting. The English word is exactly that, but it's. I'm not really. I don't know. I'm not absolutely present. I'm sort of sort of there are various factors that are influencing what I'm doing.
Gazing or floating in space almost.
I don't know if that's what it is.
Distracted.
Yeah, there's certainly an element of distraction over here. Yeah, there's distraction. Yeah, like
No, no.
you're quite. But that's
You
it.
don't pay attention what you do or what you say. You don't overthink. You just like you're more.
You're just distracted.
Yeah, you're certainly not overthinking, and you can understand clearly why in Avodat Hashem, Kalut Rosh is something to be avoided. Now, this is
So Rambam
the
is even more machmir, saying don't even mix because inevitably it's going to be
exactly. And therefore, well, we get a few important things. This is the story in the Talmud where clearly men and women were separated, and the boundaries, all sorts of the guidelines. 1 second, sorry, just 1 minute. The guidelines for why they're separated are very clear. It's Avodat Hashem and it's Kalut Rosh. I'm avoiding Kalut Rosh, and I'm also Shaloyit Arvu B'Ze'im Zeh. There are certain contexts in which men and women shouldn't be talking to one another. It's just not the appropriate thing to do. And the Simchat Beit HaShoeva is one, and we've really extrapolated to any. The Simchat Beit HaShoeva was a ceremony that took place in the Beit HaMikdash, a moment of great joy, but it was a religious ceremony. And really, Chazal have taken from there and extrapolated to understand. I want to avoid any, a moment of, like communal prayer. Then I want to avoid Kalut Rosh, and I want to avoid Shelo Yit'arvu Ze'im Zeh.
Is Kalut Rosh used commonly today, or only in?
I do see it, but I don't see. I wouldn't say I don't see it in. I see it in like rabbinic literature.
Right.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. It's a word that.
If it's even a colloquial way to say silly or.
I don't know. I'm not the best person to ask, but I don't. I'm not. I don't think so. But the fact that I don't think so isn't necessarily the proof. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to look at two approaches. I don't want to say two approaches, but two considerations based on what we just read. Really, this is the discussion in the. We look the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the Rambam. We're going to look at how Rav Moshe Feinstein bases the laws of Mechitza on the story that we just read, and then we're going to look at people who disagree with him, and then really he wrote actually twice on it, and how he writes at least two that I saw, two fairly lengthy responses on the topic of Mechitza. We're going to look at both of them, and they're slightly different. Meaning, in the second one, he adds things that he had not mentioned. In the first one, considerations perhaps written at a later stage that led him to take more things into consideration. Okay, so he's writing now in source number 4 about building a shul and how should you build the Mechitza. Now, I just want to talk about building a shul. I actually listened today to a podcast. I don't know how accurate this is. I know in England this was certainly true. In the Middle Ages, let's go back like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, in the Ashkenazi communities, a bet Knesset was a very small structure, and men would go to pray in shul, and the women really wouldn't go at all to the Bet Knesset. There was no Ezrat Nashim. The shul wasn't a huge, beautiful structure. The Jews were living.
There's some shuls in Israel like that. Like the woman, there's no section for the women at all.
So this was. I'm talking at a time of persecution. If you think of, let's say, Fiddler on the Roof. Okay. Know what it's called? Yeah. They were living under persecution. They were living in small shtetls, and life was very hard for the Jewish people. In those shuls, there wasn't an Ezrat Nashim. Yes.
As I understand, in those times, that's where we first saw the creation of a woman's siddur, which didn't mean anything other than it was a siddur that was completely in Yiddish, because women didn't know to speak Hebrew.
Yeah, there were books written in Yiddish for women.
So they produced siddurs for women, and of course they were in Yiddish because a woman can only pray in Yiddish.
Yes, excellent. Yes, you're right. That was until, exactly. That it was really men were in shul, women weren't. Now, afterwards, you came to emancipation. The Jews were able to come out from their, sort of slavery, and they were able to integrate into general society. And certainly in England, in America, Jews built these huge, beautiful shuls. because they could, because they were allowed to, because they were now integrated in society, and they were cathedral-like, huge, beautiful Bate Knesset, and the men were downstairs, and the women, like over here, were sitting upstairs. Even there, it wasn't that the men, it wasn't that like the women would go to shul that often, but at least it was more to show how we could build these huge structures, and that's what people did. I remember when we were kids, we used to have in London, there were huge shuls that were built, let's say the 18th century, 19th century, and then really the beginning of the 20th century, and they were empty by the 1970s, 1980s, because people had moved on from then. Rabbi Sachs really pushed for like the modern shul that would be much more consistent with what people were used to. I actually heard today, it was a very, very cute distinction. In the olden days, going to shul was like going to a Broadway show. Like you went for a show, and the shuls were built in order you could watch a show. Nowadays, a shul is more like a gym. You're going for your own, like you're going to participate. It's not as fancy, but everyone is taking part. And that transformation from going to a show to going to a gym has also transformed the Bet Knesset. I mention that because I wonder whether the fact that Rav Moshe Feinstein writing in the 1950s, 1960s, when people are starting to build these shuls that aren't these big cathedrals where like a couple of spectators at the top and then men spectating downstairs, but a shul that people are going to be more participatory, more of a gym for men and a gym for women. That's what led, until then, the silence. You didn't see a lot of people writing about it, but then at this stage, even though you think, shuls have been around for ages, but the question of the Mechitza, surprisingly, is not as ancient as you might think. And therefore, it's not surprising that the main arbiters, or the people that are really like forming the modern halachic approach to Mechitza, aren't writing in the 12th century or 13th century, but writing in the 20th century, because that's when the shuls that we now daven in...
Presumably in response, I'd imagine, Rob, without even hearing it, to Reform and Conservative.
That's also, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah, he's writing in America. You're right. They're all in Chutzlar, right? It's all the responsible... Oh, no, there aren't, actually. Sorry, there is also Rav Ovadia Yosef. Okay, well, let's look at Rav Moshe Feinstein. I'm sure you're right about that. Okay, so I'm going to read source number 4. Source number 4 is a gem. And it's a very, very long tshuva, and I hope I've cut down only to the bits that I think are most important for us to look at. Oh, I did dots. You can see where I cut it. Okay, so this is answering the question, he's answering a question concerning a Mechitza. What Mechitza is required between men and women in a shul, and how high should it be? Okay, so he writes like this. Bahash de לבאר עניין המחיצה שצריך להיות בין האנשים לאנשים בבית הכנסת, וכמו שהשיעור גבוה על ליבת ההלכתה, וממילא חזינו מסוגיה. דאף אם הייתה מחיצה, אבל כזו שאפשר לבוא לידי קלות ראש, יש עדיין אותו האיסור מדאורייתא. He said the point of the mechitza is, as we saw in the Mishnah, is to avoid kalut rosh. I did cut out a bit from the beginning, but we see his conclusion, and he really gets this conclusion from the Mishnah. I'm avoiding kalut rosh. You follow? I want to make sure that there's not going to be any, mixed company is a different experience to single-sex company, and there's certain situations that require the koved, like the
focus.
Focus. I think distraction is not a bad way to look at it.
Well, I think we've all experienced it. Like us right now, we're obviously it's a shiur setting. We're a bunch of guys together. If it was, or if you're at a Shabbos meal and it's just guys versus Shabbos meal and it's guys and then there's someone's wife and someone's daughter there, it changes everything, or it changes a significant amount of the topic of conversation.
Yeah.
So that it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate when it's just guys. I'm saying the topic of conversation is different.
Yeah, so I want to. The truth is, it is probably as important to talk about when there is a mechitza and talk about when there isn't a mechitza. You follow? We're going to discuss quite a lot about when there is a mechitza. I think it'll be important to spend a few minutes at the end to speak about that. It's very important. A family unit is a family unit, and therefore that obviously in the context of a family, a mechitza is inappropriate. That's why you might have, for example, a wedding where there might be a mechitza because that's the general public, but you might have sheva brachot with all the cousins coming together, but that would be without mechitza because there's kalut rosh. There's sort of, it's not so much. Well, we'll come back to. Maybe I've opened too much. We're going to talk about that a little bit in more detail later on. Just put that at the back of your mind, and we'll come back to it. Okay, so we're avoiding. It's quite clear to Rav Moshe Feinstein that I'm trying to avoid kalut rosh. You follow? That's what I don't want to have in a bet knesset. Given shuz shchu lamod neked asherim v'abituchot kedei lirot et ha-simcha ra'u sheba'u lidei kalut rosh v'lo hila mechitza. Im kein haya adayin asur midoraisa lechein hutar lasot hagazuz surah shem yizeh ra'aya shehi midoraisa. We see it's a problem to oraita because partly because we see the great efforts the rabbis did to eliminate any kalut rosh. Meaning the first time round, they tried to solve the problem. They had all the women on the inside, all the men on the outside. Now that probably made it better because they were separate, but it didn't solve the problem. So they said, okay, we'll try the other way around. Let's have the women on the outside, men on the inside. Probably also improved it, but that's not good enough. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, it had to eliminate the kalut rosh. You follow? Yeah, it's not about making things better. It's about eradicating the kalut rosh. And Rav Moshe Feinstein the Mishnah tells us about we tried this, we tried that, until we got it right. Why? Because it's so important to eliminate the kalut rosh. You follow? It wasn't enough to improve the situation. You had to eradicate the problem. So that's his first point, and he explains, that's why the Gemara tells us about the process that led towards the balcony. You follow? Yes. Okay, now we come to something very important. היוצא מזה, גם בבתי כנסיות שמתקבצים שם אנשים ונשים להתפלל, טוב יותר לעשות גזוס ראש האנשים יהיו למעלה. His ideal is to have a separation where the women are above and the men are below, ואם מאיזה טעם קשה לעשות גזוס ראש, צריכים לעשות מחיצה ממש, כדי שתמנע לבוא לידי קלות ראש. You see, again, קלות ראש, you have to have a mechitza in order to avoid a קלות ראש. Now, I just want to mention to you what he doesn't say, or Rav Moshe Feinstein doesn't say. We'll see this in later writings. Rav Moshe Feinstein's concern is only kalut rosh. So the problem is not that men and women can see each other, meaning it's not a problem, it's not distracting for me to see a woman, it's distracting for me to communicate with a woman. You follow? It's the communication between men and women that lead to the kalut rosh. Because in the Beit HaMikdash, the women were above and the men were below. So they could see each other. In fact, the women could see what was going on. If the women could see what was going on below, then the men could also see up. But they weren't communicating with one another, and therefore I solved the problem of the kalut rosh. Therefore, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, he believes that Saki b'mechitza kavor ad achara ktefaim. The mechitza should be above the shoulders. Tarich hazina shemechitza eina mitzad isur istaklut. Do you see this? The problem is not histaklut. I'm not worried about seeing one another. I'm worried about communicating with one another. Do you see? The only thing that we know is that the women were above, the men were below. However, we don't see that they couldn't see each other. You follow? That's Rav Moshe Feinstein's idea. Okay, and then if you have to, he quotes the Rambam that we looked at a minute ago. The Rambam, do you see over here? The Rambam said, "Kadei shelo yitarvu elu im elu." You follow? It's the mixing, it's the chatting that we want to avoid. It's not the histaklut. And therefore, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, you could have a bet knesset where, unlike Machon Meir, where the men are below, the women are above, but no need for curtains, because the concern is to separate them, but not that they shouldn't be able to see one another. You follow?
So peeking through the Mechitza is not actually problematic. It's not actually.
Let's see the next page, maybe.
Okay,
Correct.
so far, based on what we've seen so far. Okay. I'm going to write out לפיכך, גם בבתי כנסיות שלנו, שמתקבצים להתפלל, צריך שתהיה מחיצה, ודווקא מחיצה כזו שלא יבוא מתוכה לידי קלות ראש. I'm avoiding, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, קלות ראש. Right? גזוס ראש האנשים למעלה ואנשים למטה, ואף כשנראות משם, even though you can see one another, nevertheless, I'm going to avoid kalut rosh. So therefore, Rav Moshe Feinstein's saying that the key is kalut rosh. You have to avoid any inappropriate, just sort of a mixed company. You know, if we were sitting in the room here studying, and there was a link, and there was a glass, and there was a group of women studying there, so we wouldn't be communicating with them, and therefore we wouldn't be involved in kalut rosh, and therefore that would be an appropriate solution. That is the words of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, he wrote this in the first volume. I get that's either the 1950s or the 1960s, but I don't know exactly. Okay. Now we're going to see two positions that disagree with him. But the truth is, I'm actually going to go to source number 6 before we go to source number 5. Source number 6 is a Sridei Eish. Sridei Eish is Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg is a survivor of the Shoah. In fact, Sridei Eish means embers from the fire. What's the word? Embers from the fire. Sridei Eish.
Right, it's an ember.
He feels like as we know, Churban of really destroyed so many holy Jews, and he's one of the survivors. So he wrote it like in awareness that he's just a tiny little bit from the original fire, but also beautiful. Yeah, the remains, correct. Yeah, but once you've got a little bit of fire, you can do you know what I mean? Like you can relight. It doesn't matter, you can have a huge fire. All you need is a tiny little spark.
To reignite.
It's a beautiful, beautiful idea. Anyway, he says something over here. I want to read it to you, and then I'd like to share a little story to open our discussion a bit wider. Okay. Now the Rambam, if you remember, we looked at the Rambam on the first page, and the Rambam added, if you remember, Shelo yit'arbu ze'im zeh. His concern is that men and women will mix with one another. Right? Do you remember that? Now, the Rambam also wrote, as you probably know, a commentary on the Mishnah. However, the Rambam on the Mishnah in Sukkah, source number 1, the Rambam on the Mishnah says something else. And the Sridei Eish points this out. Hinei Yadua, everybody knows. This is, means that he knows. Masha Kataf Rambam bePerush HaMishnah Sukkah Perek Hey Mishnah Bet, which is our Mishnah, and he says like this: Makom Anashim Lemala Mimakom HaAnashim. The men were downstairs and women were upstairs. Why? Kedei Shelo Yistaklu HaAnashim BeNashim. Did you see that? The Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah is saying something different to what he said in the Mishnah Torah. V'chein katab b'tosot Yom Tov ulam b'ilchot lulav, as we see lo yitarvu elu im elu uve'emet amru b'mitot kedei shelo yu mu'uravin. So there seems to be another factor here, and the other factor seems to be not about just mixing one another. There seems to be a distraction when men see the women. You follow? Now look what he writes at lefichach. בארצות פולין, in Poland and Lithuania, אין מחמירים כל כך, שהרי המתפלל עומד ומתפלל בסידור, ואינו מגביה עיניו למעלה. He says, the people that from Poland and Lithuania, I suppose it's also a reflection of the women. The women were not distracting, and the men were not distracted. And therefore, all they followed the guidelines that we read in Rav Moshe Feinstein, and the men were downstairs, the women were upstairs, and that was sufficient. Because the women were not distracting, the men were not distracted.
Is that because of tzniut?
Correct, yes, exactly. And also, Aval ba'Ashkenaz, Ashkenaz is Western Europe, No'agu la'achmir, they were more stringent. U'v'vaday sheyesh kam mitzad chumrat hamakom. Now, what's interesting is that different communities did different things. What was appropriate in the community of Poland was not appropriate in West Germany, in West Europe, and the way they did things in Western Europe was different meaning each one was responding to the needs. It's not like the first point that we made, which was Kalut Rosh, that's universal. Kalut Rosh will occur whenever men and women are together. There is Kalut Rosh. That's sort of built into the relationship between men and women, and therefore you'll always need a Mechitza to separate men and women. However, whether men and women can see each other, that depends a little bit on the community. You follow? In some communities they were Mekel, in other communities they were Machmir. Okay. And each place decides for themselves. If you're able to do this, then you should do it. Don't cause arguments in order to achieve this, in order to get your style of Mechitza. You hear that? Those are the words of the Sridei Eish. But he's introducing, also based on the Rambam, a second concern. The second concern, and that is, it's not enough to be separate nowadays. Nowadays, we live in a world where you shouldn't see each other during davening because of not just the Kalut Rosh, but also the distraction. You hear that? But each place according to their custom. I want to tell you a story. So Hannah and I got married in Liverpool. My wife, Hannah, is from Liverpool. I'm from London. And as we were preparing for our wedding, we were going to have dancing at the wedding. And I went to speak to my rabbi in London about the Mechitza that would be appropriate to separate men and women for the dancing at our wedding. And the rabbi of my community in London told me to call the rabbi of the community in Liverpool.
What the? Why?
Because he said, I can tell you, if your wedding was in London, then this is the way the dancing is done. And this is the appropriate way to organize the dancing, separating between men and women, meaning that's what's done in London. But I don't want to cause a machloket, be the only wedding, to go to Liverpool and then come and bring something that's not done there in order to answer the local question of the Mechitza. So you have to ask the local rabbi in Liverpool and let him decide and let him tell you what the Mechitza should be like at the wedding. This is really very much based on the Sridei Eish. The Sridei Eish is saying it depends in Poland and in Lithuania. They only had a separation but no curtain. In Western Europe, they only had, they had obviously separation, but they even had a curtain. But there's no right, meaning the Lithuania and Poland did what was the right thing to do in Lithuania and Poland. And in Western Europe, they did the right thing that they needed to be done in Western Europe as well. You follow that?
Yeah.
So what did the Liverpool rabbi say?
The actual solution, what did he actually say?
Yeah.
So what we did was, thank you so much for asking, for two reasons. First of all, it brings back happy memories, and it was a good question as well. What they do in Liverpool, they had these thick plants, and we bought plants, and we put plants. We didn't do I don't know what the word, curtains. We did these plants.
Which would have been done in London?
That was not in London. I don't know what they. We got married in Liverpool, so I have no idea what happens there.
The Rav was never even invited. The Rav was from London.
Yes, but I will tell you.
In London, was never invited to win.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. But I will tell you that my rabbi from London, obviously came to our wedding in Liverpool, and obviously took part in all the dancing. Like he didn't get involved. Yeah, I think the 3-day age is
Yeshiva or rabbi?
the rabbi of our community, the rabbi of our community in London. Okay, so we've seen two very, very important ideas. One is kalut rosh. The second one is histaklut. One is frivolity. The other one is looking at the people. Now I want to go very. I'd like to look. I don't know. Should I do this quite yet? Okay. So before we get to the last tshuva, which is a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, I want to talk very, very briefly about events in which it is appropriate, for things to be separate, and events in which it's appropriate to be mixed. I think that kalut rosh is not something that is appropriate at sometimes and inappropriate at other times. I think kalut rosh is something which is never appropriate, meaning kalut rosh is never appropriate. It's not that this is a holy event and therefore we're going to have a mechitza in order to avoid kalut rosh. I think that there is an effort to avoid kalut rosh at all times. I think in the context of a family, you don't get kalut rosh. That's why I really don't like the word flirting. But there's something about that, it's like with the unfamiliar, you follow? Like it's not, within the context of a family, kalut rosh just isn't something that's present. Yeah, it's not present in that context. And therefore, in all contexts that there is a concern for kalut rosh, then it's important that there should be separate, that men and women should be separate. In any context where there's not a concern for kalut rosh, so then it's okay. It may be okay for men and women to be together, but there's a second concern, and that's sniut and histaklut. Any time that if women are going to be, the men should not be tested by being in the context of women who are not dressed appropriately. That's why, for example, obviously, men and women don't go to the beach. You only have a separate times that men go, times that women go. That's the histaklut. That's obvious. But I like the difference between a wedding where you don't know necessarily everybody. The wedding is for the wider community, and it seems that this concern of kalut rosh, maybe histaklut, could be present in the context of a wedding, and therefore that's why many times a wedding, to be separate at a wedding or other events, could be inappropriate because you're opening up to the wider community. But a family event wouldn't need a mechitza because you're not going to come to kalut rosh within the familiar context of a family. Is that clear to you? Mm-hmm. There's one more situation. I think we understand shuls obviously are places where there has to be a mechitza. I think that in other places where histaklut, looking, could be a problem, obviously is an issue. One of the hot topics being discussed nowadays is, what about if you went to a concert? Right. Let's say you went to a Moti Steinmetz or Mordechai Ben David or Avram Fried or Yaakov Shweki, going to a modern Hasidic concert. We're not talking about going to Paul McCartney or something like that. So we can assume there is a problem in going to those sorts of concerts. There's a problem of histaklut. There's probably not, like a healthy environment to be in. Like it's different. I'm not really a cinema sort of person, but to go to the movie theatre in a mixed environment is probably not as terrible. It's not, if it's a good film and it's all the other criteria for going to watch a film are fulfilled, then that could be fine. You go, you sit down, you watch a film. But going to a concert, I don't mean Beethoven, but I mean a modern concert. I don't even know names of modern bands, so I won't even embarrass myself to come up with some names. But people, that they're telling you to get up and dance, and to be standing next to someone who's dancing is not a good idea. So the question is, in a religious situation, environment, is it appropriate or inappropriate? So there are really two approaches that I've seen in like in halakha, and for me they both seem to make sense. I like them both. One of them is, well, there's three. One is you only have men at the concert or only have women. That's quite extreme, but that exists. Look, there are people that will only appear in front of a single-sex audience. That's one. The second one is where you have like men, a bit like you sort of like men on one floor and women on another floor, so you can't see the other one. When you come in and when you come out, you're only surrounded by men, and the women are only surrounded by women. That's a second solution that's quite popular. A third solution, you have boys, right?
Yes.
No, but let's say your wife wants to go. I mean, it's quite limiting. Let's say Avidar family want to go to a concert, so it would not be as much fun, I imagine, for the family, for Abba to go with the boys downstairs, and Ima would like to wave from upstairs. So therefore, there's a third type of concert where they have men's, and that's like at the yeshiva bochum, and they would go and sit in one area, and then you have the women on the other side, and then you have family seating. Now the family seating tends to have less dance. It's all like old cronies, which Abba and Ima's got any energy to be getting up. It's not like all the youngsters that are up and down and jumping. And that's a third solution that's tried to deal with that situation. But there, it's less the kalut rosh, because you're not, but it's more the histaklut might be the answer there. I think in terms of, sort of guidelines, I think it's quite a personal, sort of, like everybody has to fix their guidelines that work for them. You understand what the red lines are. The red lines are kalut rosh and histaklut. You should never be in a situation that could lead you to kalut rosh or histaklut. Now, in sort of halakha guides us to